I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On this episode, we'll discuss impressions from the DJ Lagway Gators breakdown interview with Will and Gator Dave. Just last night here, recording this here Thursday night. They did that on Wednesday night. Fresh meat in the SEC in 2024. Just got the word before we went live here. Want to talk about Texas and Oklahoma joining the league. We'll do the dance on this Rashada deal one more time. Believe me, we're not super excited about talking about it, but new details coming out. Andy Staples and a group of writers from The Athletic did a great job detailing the contract there, so we got the final details on that. Hopefully it'll be the last time we talk about Rashada, Will. NFL Combine invites that went out. How many Gators were included and which ones will be headed to Indianapolis to be evaluated by the NFL scouts? Will, how you doing, man?
Doing all right, man. Starting to warm up a little bit here. We had our little league draft the other night, so it's almost spring up here. One of these days I'll be able to be in my little basement office without a hoodie on because it gets cold down here. But it's about to heat up for everybody down there, and where I'm at, it's about to finally get nice. So I'm looking
Man.
forward to it. Finally, that good time of year for us.
When I lived up in New York, I used to tell everybody that winter's optional. You don't have to do this to yourself. And I opted out a few years ago, and been pretty nice being back in Florida in the winter. All right, let's move on here to two bits. You and Dave landed an interview with DJ Lagway, the 5-star commit out of Texas at quarterback here. And great interview. He basically said that the biggest thing he liked about the school in general was he said he loved the atmosphere overall, but he said the coaches were very genuine. Like he felt the genuine nature from them from the very beginning. Plans to enroll early next spring. You had asked Lagway about his release. He said it reminded you of Dan Marino. That's quite the comparison. Bet you he enjoyed that. He might have gotten off the phone and said, "Who's Dan Marino?" This old guy was asking me about Dan Marino, dude. And basically he mentioned that when he visited the swamp, he said the fan experience was just completely different than what he experienced in other places. But just to demonstrate that this seems like a kid that really gets it, he said, "I want to give these fans the happiness they deserve, and I'm going to get it back to where it used to be." Total confidence from the guy. Definitely a guy that I'm looking forward to seeing playing in the orange and blue one day. Will, how'd you enjoy the conversation with DJ Lagway?
It was great. He was coming back from a workout, which is always nice, right? He's sitting there working out. That's when we got him on there. There was an article in The Athletic a day or two ago that you had sent me where he was talking about his experience during the Kentucky game, and they were chanting "Lagway to the swamp" while he was in there, and he said that was the only place he'd experienced that. And then also Tebow came out, and all of a sudden the fans were trying to convince Tebow to help recruit him to Florida. So, from a historical perspective and understanding what a quarterback means at the University of Florida, it's pretty clear that he gets that. I thought it was really interesting. I asked him what people would see when they looked at his film on like Huddle or something like that. And he said swag. And I'm like, he didn't shy away when I asked him what his plan was. I go, "Do you plan on being the starter day one in 2024? He goes, "Yeah, it's plan." It's like, all right. So, he comped himself to Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes.
Yep, not afraid to make that comparison.
Hey, making that, but I thought it was really interesting. There were a couple of things that we asked him. He ran a lot less in his junior year than his sophomore year, and he was more effective when he ran, but he ran a lot less. I sort of asked him about that, and he said that he had to learn other ways to win and move the ball down the field because he suffered a high ankle sprain, and so he had to do things that were different. So I think when I was asking him sort of why that improvement happened between his junior and senior year, that was what he talked about, was the high ankle sprain limiting him, but then allowing him to expand his games in other places. Then I asked him to take us through a progression, and he started going, "First thing I look at is the safeties, middle of the field open, middle of the field closed, read the cornerbacks for man or zone, then the defensive line, linebacker alignment, and then I'm looking for what kind of post-snap adjustments the guys are going to make." And I asked him, does he see a lot of post-snap adjustments, or is it sort of what you see is what you get? He's like, no, we're in the state of Texas. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that happens post-snap. So from the standpoint of, and then I had looked at his film earlier in the day. I'm not kidding I'll put it on Twitter after we do this, but I have a GIF that I sent Dave before the interview yesterday, and it's a little out where he has to throw it above the linebacker and below the corner, and he throws the ball with just enough touch to get it to his receiver, but it was like the minute he decided to throw it, it was out. It was like, whoo, like that's like, he just does not bring the ball back. He's like a catcher, right? A catcher, when he throws the ball to second, never brings his arm past his ear because he's got to get the ball out fast. And they time those guys and train them to do that. And it really looked like that when he was, when I was looking at the film. So look, I mean, there's nothing's guaranteed, right? But you get a guy who's who's got that swag and that confidence, but certainly a respectful kid. And then, I asked him who he was recruiting, and he immediately went to the offensive line. So he certainly knows where his bread's buttered. He wasn't looking for skill position guys. He was saying, I need somebody who can protect me so I can get the job done. And, so it was a fun interview, but also one of those things where I think we learned a little bit about, where he's at. The fact that he's immediately talking about middle of field open, middle of field closed, determining whether it's cover 2, cover 3, cover 4, like that sort of stuff. You're like, all right, they're not going to have to teach him a ton about what he's doing pre-snap. They're going to have to teach him stuff about the Florida offense. But in terms of reading defenses and understanding why he went from completing 56% of his passes his sophomore year to 67% his junior year, obviously we want to see him carry that through to his senior year to be sure that that is who he is. But given what he was talking about, I don't really have a whole lot of doubt that he's going to be able to do that.
Yeah, bright kid too. I mean, good interview. He went back and forth with you guys in there, good answers and everything. And it was something where I mean, really listening to the interview, I think he does better than most of the college players I hear get interviewed actually. So I thought he did a great job overall in the interview. But what was your overall impressions of him just talking to him one-on-one there like that with you and Dave?
Well, I mean, you talk to these folks before you actually go live, right? So you get an opportunity to see him sort of with the veil down, and then you get to see him when the lights go on. And he was the same kid before as he was, afterwards. Yes sir, no sir, the whole way through. Certainly, I think a reflection of his father and his family and his upbringing and those sorts of things. But look, I mean, I think any story you've read about him has talked about how NIL is involved, but it's second, and essentially that he wants to earn the money when he comes, and part of that is because of the state of Texas and their NIL laws. It's different than the state of California, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think some of it is just there are different attitudes and different cultures. We've all experienced that when we're hiring somebody at our own jobs, right? There are people who fit and people who don't. And I think one of the things that is really clear is that DJ Lagway thinks that he fits the culture that Billy Napier's trying to win. I mean, trying to build. Like he talked about, not just Napier, but talked about Ryan O'Hara, talked about Joe Hamilton, and he's talking to Joe Hamilton on a daily basis. But again, look, he's a 5-star guy, right? So Florida would be derelict if they weren't reaching out to him all the time and making him feel like he was wanted. But I think.
Well, he said other schools are still talking to him quite a bit as well.
Absolutely.
And he said, I'm taking the calls just to be respectful, but I'm fully committed to the University of Florida.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think whenever somebody commits this early, and this I think is maybe the impression I got, he didn't say it, but whenever somebody commits this early, they've made up their mind. And Rashada comes in and he commits to Miami, and a couple of months later he's flipping to Florida, and then all the stuff goes on, and like you worry about a guy like that flipping, not necessarily because of the NIL dollars, but just because when you've had a year and a half where you've committed to somebody, it's really hard to break that off. When you got a month where you committed to somebody, it's a whole lot easier to say, hey, I made a mistake, I'm going to change my mind. And Lagway now is getting involved in the recruiting. He talked about that, like who he's in contact with, who he's recruiting. So now you get all these guys who are like depending on you going there, right? Because they're making their decisions based on where you're going. And so that breakup becomes even more difficult. And again, if you're somebody who values your word and values the process, he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who's going to say, oh yeah, I'll commit, and then decide later, no, I didn't want to do that. I suspect that he is getting deeper and deeper into his relationship with Florida and seeing himself as a Gator. And let's be honest, the quarterback position is wide open for him too, right? I mean, it's not as though there's 3 people on the roster in front of him and he's going to have to fight to earn the starting position. If DJ Lagway comes in and is anything as good as what he looks on film and his stats suggest and what Florida's going to need, he's going to be starting really quickly when he gets in there. So there's no real reason. And again, maybe, we've talked a lot about Graham Mertz. Maybe they had some options to bring in some guys who might have had 2 years of eligibility, and they decided, we're going to get the guy with 1 year of eligibility so that we can start Lagway when he comes in. Because let's be honest, I mean, that's going to be the thing that's make or break for Billy Napier. If DJ Lagway comes in and becomes a star, Napier ends up staying at Florida for a really long time. If DJ Lagway comes in and struggles and ends up, sort of being like an Emory Jones, well, now Napier's really going to struggle to hold on at that point, because now you're 4 or 5, 6 years in and you haven't hit on the quarterback. Now, I mean, maybe the recruiting upticks significantly, and so then you don't have to worry about it because there's hope in terms of building the program. But that was really, the recruiting did in Dan Mullen quite a bit, but then so did the fact that Emory Jones was his handpicked guy, and Jones just wasn't great. right? If Jones had been fantastic, it would have been no problem. We would still have Mullen in Gainesville, even with the recruiting deficiencies. So Lagway's sort of the make or break it for Napier. And again, when you ask somebody, what do you see when you look on film? I expect them to talk about his release or his footwork or pre-snap reads or something like that. Just swag. Like you're going to see some swag. I'm like, all right, buddy, I'm looking forward to it.
DJ Swagway, let's go print up the t-shirts. Let's go. Hey, for one more question on this, then we'll move on here to floor bits. How encouraged are you by hearing a guy of that stature, that 5-star quarterback in the class? This is the guy who we have desperately wanted to get on board at Florida in the recruiting, particularly in the last cycle, but didn't happen as much last cycle. A little discouraged by it. But how encouraging is it to hear him talk about the relationship with the coaches, the relationship with Napier, and really you see this and you play it and contrast it against what happened with Rashada. And is it looking like that Napier's approach where it might be the tortoise and the hare type of deal, but maybe his way is starting to win out a little bit here as we get deeper into the NIL era?
I mean, maybe a little bit. I think. Look, the 2024 class is off to an awesome start.
Yeah.
Not just with DJ Lagway, but there's three other blue chip recruits. 3 of the 4 are top 60 guys. So the 2024 class is off to a really significant, a really fast start. And it's interesting. I was looking the other day because Dave and I are next week going to do something where we look at sort of the prospects who are on the board for Florida, and it's not as loaded in the state of Florida this year as it was last year. And so the 2024 class, they're going to have to go outside of the state. They're going to have to expand their bubble. Miami's actually loaded in the state. Everywhere else is kind of it's a little bit thin pickings unless you're going to rate IMG, and that's not really a Florida school, so it's kind of hard to project that, right? So look, Napier's got his work cut out for him for this 2024 class, but he has the Pied Piper to start with, right? I mean, everyone's going to want to come play with a 5-star quarterback who they know they're going to get 3 years to work with, right? If he comes in and he's the starter day one, then everybody who comes in knows that they're going to get 3 years or 2 years of the guy or whatever as the different classes move on. And so having that guy in place who can galvanize the recruiting efforts, right? That once he gets to campus, every single recruit that comes in is going to get a chance to talk to DJ Lagway if he's going to have any sort of impact on the offense, right? Like they have guys that they pair up with when it comes to official visits and take them out on the town and do things like that. And Lagway, I'm sure, will be involved in that sort of stuff too when it's a high level guy they want to bring in. And look, I mean, the criticism for the 2023 class from me was not the guys that they brought in. It's that they only brought in 20. And if they'd have brought in 24 and it had 3 5-stars and a guy in like the 50 or 60 range, all of a sudden that's a top 5 class and we're really happy with it. So Lagway is the start of that for this 2024 class. If they can add one more guy sort of in that top 30 range and then fill out the rest of the class the way it has been, I think we're all going to be really happy about it. And again, I think having that guy who said, I'm going to plant my flag at the University of Florida, this is where I want to be. I am the guy who's going to be the quarterback, the next great quarterback for the Gators, come along for the ride. That makes a difference, right? And Napier can sell that. So I don't know that it's so much tortoise in the hare so much as it is getting the right guy in at the right time in order to put things together. I do think, it's a fair criticism that NIL has changed recruiting a little bit and that there's an opportunity to maybe boost it and maybe focus dollars and deals at particular timestamps. So we'll see. I mean, college football has definitely changed and we're going to talk about that in 4 bits. So, but again,
good transition there, Will. Good transition. Let's move on and talk about that 2024 season that's upcoming. DJ Lagway coming to campus. Among other changes in college football, you got the 12-team playoff coming in, USC, UCLA over to the Big Ten, but in our own league, in the SEC, Texas and Oklahoma, after looking kind of iffy with all the TV deals, they were looking like they couldn't get out of some things. It was going to be 25 confirmed tonight on Thursday night here that Texas and Oklahoma will be in the SEC starting next season in 2024. This was massive news when it came out. I believe it was just a year or two ago, Will. And I'll tell you what, the SEC, they're going to have to reimagine the conference scheduling. That's for sure. I've already seen a lot of badly drawn maps on Twitter about this. And, hey, let's just kick Alabama and Auburn over to the East. Yeah, I'm not sure about that exactly. If that's going to be a nice and balanced with Alabama and Georgia squaring off every year in the SEC East, right? I'm not sure how they're going to do it, Will. I'm kind of leaning toward the elimination of divisions altogether. but it's going to be interesting in the next 12 months to see how this thing plays out.
Yeah, when the announcement came out, I started looking at the recruiting rankings from 2014, I think, until 22. I've got
Mhm.
those rankings all collated together, and I've got the SEC now with those two guys put in there. The interesting thing is you don't think of it like this. I think of Oklahoma and Texas as elite recruiting institutions. They're not really. They're with A&M, Florida, Auburn, Tennessee, a little bit below LSU. So they're in a grouping of teams. And so, the Texas and Oklahoma fans are about to get a little bit of a rude awakening, because when you're that quality of recruiting in the SEC, you may rise up every once in a while to make a playoff, but you're going to get beat down by Alabama and Georgia on a fairly decent at a fairly decent clip. So I don't think they're going to remake the SEC. I think they make the SEC a lot deeper, though. But again, with a 12-team playoff, maybe that helps you, right? That a loss to Oklahoma is, especially if it's like at Oklahoma, isn't going to be seen as like this awful thing. But I'm going to be really interested. The thing that's going to be interesting to me is all the non-conference stuff, right? I mean, Florida has all these home and home scheduled now pretty much for the next decade. They're going to Notre Dame at some point.
Mhm.
There's NC State on the schedule. Colorado's on the schedule. So we
Texas
get to fight
was.
Dion.
Yeah.
Texas was on the schedule, so that'll obviously get revamped. You got Utah next year, right? When you have those years where you've got Utah and Florida State on either end, and now you've got 16 teams in the SEC, if they end up going to like a 9-team schedule or something like that, all of a sudden those seasons are going to be brutal in terms of what you have to face. Now, I know you sort of joked about Alabama moving over to the East and, making things unbalanced, but the reality is the East has been really unbalanced now for like a decade. And it's been Florida, Georgia, and everybody else for a decade, except for Missouri kind of jumped up there a couple of years when Michael Sam was there at defensive end. And so, I do think there's probably an opportunity for alignment here to give it a little bit of top feeders and a little bit of bottom feeders in both sides, as opposed to making it LSU, A&M, Auburn, Ole Miss, all with Alabama over there in the West. It's a gauntlet, and a team like Ole Miss really struggles to even when they have a good year to make their way all the way up to the top, just because it's such a gauntlet. But again, LSU won it last year, so it's not as though it's Alabama every year, and that's sort of the key, I think, to the SEC is you can rise up and win every once in a while. The question to me for Oklahoma and Texas, I mean, look, Texas has struggled over the last few years in terms of converting recruiting into winning. And Oklahoma has just owned the Big 12. And I think that's going to be a rude awakening for their fans, because they are not going to own the SEC. They may win it a couple of times in the next decade, but I'd be really surprised if they end up being the top dogs in the SEC the way they have been in the Big 12.
Yeah, I don't think Kansas State's going to be your biggest challenge anymore there, Oklahoma. But yeah, obviously two awesome programs overall with excellent history. Texas, you certainly see what they're doing. They're gearing up. I mean, I saw today on Twitter that Quinn Ewers shaved his mullet, so he must be taking the quarterback battle a little seriously with
He
Arch
just knows he
Manning.
can't have that hair back there keeping him warm when he's in the swamp. It's too hot for a mullet in the swamp.
Yeah, Manning scared the mullet off the guy, so he must be taking that kind of serious to show up with that kind of change. But
Well,
I,
I will have to say one thing I do want to say is that if nothing else, this does sort of break up the monotony. Like, I can guarantee you in the next 3 or 4 years, I usually travel down for one game a year. I can guarantee you if Texas or Oklahoma is coming to the swamp,
oh yeah,
that'll be the game that I look at and circle and say, how do I make it down for that one? Because it is like, I mean, for a little while, it's going to be like a non-conference game where you got one of the big boys coming in, right? And Utah was fun this year. I went down for that one, and they were a top 10 team at the time. And it was fun, but it wasn't like taking on like a top 10 Texas or a top 10 Oklahoma team. If you get one of those guys going to the swamp where they're rated pretty highly, I think that's going to be fun for the fans to experience something different. And so, look, this is an entertainment business, and the fact that it's going to be something different, I think, is going to be a valuable thing for Florida and for the SEC.
I don't have the exact format off the top of my head here, but I would like to see some type of format where you protect a couple of your rivals. I'd like to see Florida. Obviously, Florida and Georgia is a must, but South Carolina's close by. Tennessee, some of those games, protected 2 to 3 of those games, and the rest of it, get that schedule rotating a little more. Like, it's ridiculous to play Alabama once every 10 years. As much as I'm not dying for Alabama on the schedule right now, it's ridiculous that they come to the swamp like once a decade. We should have a much better rotation within the league, and I hope whatever the situation is, they end up resolving that issue above all.
Yeah, I'll be interested. I'm wondering whether they're going to divide it up into 4 team pods. It would actually
That'd
be
be
kind of interesting
great.
to do 4 team pods, play a
Yeah,
schedule where you rotate around the pods,
love that.
and then instead of having an SEC championship, play a 4 team tournament for the teams that win the pods, and
The
then do
the real
something like that.
playoff.
Yeah, the real playoff or something like that, right? Like because then you get the big time games. Because that's the thing, is with 16 teams, you're not going to be able to play everybody. And so if Georgia and Alabama never play each other, then what have we actually proven with the season? And I don't know whether the SEC championship game is going to survive, given the fact that you got the
Is
playoff and all that other
I was
stuff.
going to say, is there even a need for it with the 12-team playoff? I mean, there is because you want to crown a champion in the conference, I guess. But I'm looking at the 12-team playoff. If you play 4 teams, if you have 4 teams in position, hypothetically, for a 12-team playoff, and one of them has a bad loss to the other one in a hypothetical SEC semis or something, that ruins their chance to maybe make the 12-team field, right?
Yeah, the
So
problem the
I
problem is
don't know
going
if
to
they want
be
to hurt that. So they
I,
might keep it with the top 2 teams go to Atlanta still. I can't see them giving up the money with that game. I
so
can't see
I
that.
don't know that that matters as much as the thing I'm worried about the 12 team playoff is that you're going to get what you get in week 17 of the NFL, right? Or week 18 now in the NFL. Like we
Well,
all
the
know
only thing
there's
I'd argue is you play for seeding. So you the top 4, you get a bye into the second round in the
sure,
12-team
but I mean,
playoff.
again, if you look at Georgia this year, if Georgia had lost the SEC championship, they were still going to the playoff. And so they were still in the top 4. And
Yeah.
so if you get to that stage where you can essentially just sit your guys, then what does it matter? That's the stuff I worry about with the playoff. There's a reason, we all know it. There's a reason why fantasy football all ends 2 weeks before the season ends, right? Because we all know that the teams are going to be sitting their players. And look, as the season gets longer and longer and longer, it may even be worth sitting them in the last game of the year. Like, think about it. If you had, like, let's say Florida State really, really struggles and next year, and Florida has or 2 years from now, Florida has an unbelievable season and is coasting into the playoff. Well, you could take off the Florida State game, potentially win it and still be a number 1 seed or a seed where you get the bye. Or even if you don't get the bye, you just gave yourself a bye by not by not having your starters play against Florida State. I don't want that to happen to the rivalry. So that's the thing I hope they do. I don't really care how the division's set up. I hope what they do is make sure that the games are meaningful the whole way through the season, because that's my biggest worry with the 12-team playoff, just in college football in general, is that when Florida lost to Ole Miss in 2008, that was something where the extra point goes wide. And I remember sitting on the floor and just like falling over and going, I can't freaking believe that happened. And just sitting there sort of in stunned silence. Now that wouldn't even matter. It'd be like, all right, we lost to Ole Miss, but it doesn't matter. Just run the table and we're going to be like a top 4 seed, right? And so you lose that aspect of college football by doing the expansion. So hopefully they can build some of that in to the actual conferences, or the way they set up the conference structure.
Yeah, well, we can kick hypotheticals around all day, but we'll dig into that a little more in the offseason, I'm sure. Let's move on to 6 bits. In the meantime, the Athletic article with Andy Staples and company. It was a whole bunch of writers on that article. I did not write down all their names, but it was a group effort. Andy Staples was the one out in front presenting it, though. Jaden Rashada contract details that were obtained by the Athletic. What they confirmed that they would have paid him $13.85 million over the course of 4 years, and it is by far the highest known number for a college player. That includes a $500,000 upfront payment. After that, his payments would increase from $250,000 a month as a freshman to $291,000 a month as a sophomore, to $375K as a junior, and back to $195K as a senior. Look at that senior discount. I guess you can call it that, Will. So long as he fulfilled the following obligations. That's all he had to do. He had to hold a residence in Gainesville, Florida. He'd have to do at least one branded Twitter post and one branded Instagram post per month, up to 8 fan engagement sessions per year. That includes in-person experience, social media engagement, video conferences, and interviews. None would last longer than 2 hours. Autograph up to 15 pieces of merchandise per year. I want to sign this contract, man. This contract also states that the collective can, in its sole and absolute discretion, terminate the agreement without the penalty of or further obligation. So, a couple of notes I really found interesting from the article. That those were the terms, obviously, but the couple notes I found interesting. in switching from Miami to Florida, he did actually change his NIL advisors, his new representation. One of them was actually a sophomore at SMU, Will, who apparently I think there was a connection with the kid from his days at IMG. Rashada was at IMG for a minute. And this firm, they do list Darren Heitner as their quote affiliate law firm, unquote, and it advertises that Heitner assists them and their clients in all legal matters and dispute resolution. So it seems like Heitner might have played some sort of role in connecting the two parties overall there, but still, I'm honestly not super interested in that detail in particular, Will. I'm more interested in the numbers. So we could get into the whole thing with the collective and talk about the whole story and everything. It's a good article in The Athletic. I encourage y'all to read it. But I really just want to talk about these numbers real quick. What are your thoughts on the fact that 13.85 million ended up being correct?
I think it's a dereliction of duty by a bunch of different people to not raise red flags when they saw that number, and irrespective of who it is, and it's not one person specifically, but that number for a player of Rashada's ilk at the time. Now Rashada's even fallen further since in the rankings, but where he was in the rankings. So I'm working on something where I'm trying to put together a tool for valuation. I'm sure I'll be writing about it in the not too distant future. But basically, we kind of know what a top five quarterback, like in the top five of the national rankings, what a quarterback's worth, because we had the leaked contract to The Athletic for Iamaleava is alleged that he's the one who got it, and it was $8 million over 4 years. So if you take that, you shouldn't go over $8 million for a guy who's ranked well below Iamaleava, right? And so that's the first thing, is that anything over 8 is ridiculous. So then it's like, all right, well, is it 7.9? What should it be? And the way I'm trying to evaluate is I'm saying, all right, well, what percentage of a top 5 class is somebody of Rashada's ilk versus a guy like Iamaleava? Because Iamaleava is like 10, like he's worth about 10% of what a top 5 class would be worth. Rashada is worth about half that. He's worth 5%. So I actually have his valuation. And then you got to make some adjustments for quarterbacks, because quarterbacks are a much more valuable entity than offensive linemen and those sorts of things. And I've tried to do that. And I'll, like I said, I'll have something coming out on this relatively soon. But I pegged Rashada's 4-year value at about $3.8 million. That's based on where he was ranked at the time. And so Miami had already overpaid him given the reported money that had been going his way. Now, do you front load it? Do you need to do that to flip? All that sort of stuff. But so when we talk about getting into bidding wars, I'm not saying that you bid over and over and over again and go way above what you think someone should be slotted at. But I do think you need to understand where you stop and where you start. And that's the thing, right? Is that they did get into a bidding war and no one knew when to stop. And they stopped about $10 million higher than I have him valued at. And you're gonna, like, you've been on me a lot repeatedly about this, about like, you can't have somebody making that much money. It's going to impact the culture on the team, all that sort of stuff. I think that's true from the standpoint, if you have somebody who's making that much money and it's not in line with what other people of his position are getting, that it can be a problem. So again, I just look at it and say that's a strategic thing. That's a how to. And my original article on this talked about strategic vision and casting that strategic vision. And you don't have to tell the collective how to do the job, but you do need to tell them how you value players. And so, this is like honestly, that number is something that should be reserved for Arch Manning, not for Jaden Rashada. And the other thing that's really interesting to me in this entire thing is whoever Rashada's representation was, that's a tough contract, where essentially you allow the other entity to terminate at any time. Like, what? Like, there's no reason. There doesn't have to be any reason for it or anything like that. Now, look, maybe that's not the entire contract. I haven't read it, but essentially that means you have no contract. That means it's a one-way thing. If he'd have played like crap in his first year and Florida had decided, or the collective, not Florida, but the collective had decided, hey, we don't want to have this contract anymore, they could have just terminated it and said, all right, we paid you for a year and we're done.
Crazy.
And so, I think there's probably some social pressure where you wouldn't want to do that. But I mean, hell, they just took the hit on it right now, right? Where the message out there is Florida's not going to make good on its commitments is going to be the negative recruiting spin that comes from other schools. So why wouldn't you do that after year 1 or after year 2 if somebody doesn't pan out? I just look at it and I go, that's not like whenever you're executing. And so when you think about like the mistrust that was reported on between Rashada and some of the Florida camps, it shouldn't be a surprise because that contract is tilted towards the collective, right? It doesn't matter. Like the money is huge, but if you can get out of it at any time along the way, hell, they could have canceled it 6 games into the season, right? I mean, there's from what they're reporting in there, there's nothing to protect the player, and so that I think in the NFL they have sort of standard player contracts. And so players have agents, but there have been guys who have just gone ahead and just hired a lawyer to handle the negotiations and sort of maximize. So they're not paying a guy 10% of their salary. And one of the reasons they can do that is that there are standard player contracts. And I think one of the things that the NCAA is going to do a bunch of different things, and they're going to rattle some sabers about how you can't have pay for play and all that sort of stuff. But if they really wanted to do something significant, what this points out to me is that they should have some sort of standard NIL contract where the players have guarantees and protections when they
Right.
sign one that are already built in. Because what really I think happened here is they got a really high dollar amount without any sort of guarantee that those dollars were actually going to come through. And if you've got contracts like that floating all over the place in college football, the players aren't going to have any recourse. Right. I mean, the contract says they can break it at any time, which means they can break it at any time, which means the players get stuck and they're not going to be able to go and sue. And I want the players to maximize their earning potential when they have it. I think that's a good thing. I don't particularly like the NIL structure. I wish it came from the TV money, all those sorts of things. But if we're going to sit here and say that we're going to have name, image, and likeness deals, there needs to be some sort of standard language that allows that forces the entities that are executing the NIL contracts to actually think about what they're valuing the players at. And I am curious whether there's going to be an epidemic of this, a year or two from now, where collectives
Oh, it's
don't have
coming.
money, and not because it's their fault or not because they intended to, but just they run out of funds. And if they run out of funds and can't make their commitments, they don't have to if the
No,
contract's written
no,
like this.
no different than any other business setting. Will like they run out of money, can't pay, won't pay. It's going to be all kinds of stories floating out here. We're just the first big one. The thing is, the only reason why NIL is viewed as any kind of positive by anybody is because it's better than what they had before. That's it, though. That's why the only positive NIL. It absolutely does not protect these guys. I read this story. I feel bad for Rashada too. I feel bad for the kid. I feel bad that he, I remember it was like going through and figuring out what college you want to go through. That's a stressful time. That's a stressful time. He thinks he's got the thing nailed down. He thinks he's got an incredible deal pinned down. And I read this story after he went to Miami, and the first figure was reported, right? It was originally around 9 million, and he went out to the Elite 11 camp, I believe it was, and he said they said all the kids were just surrounding him. How'd you get that number? What'd you do? And he just had no interest in that conversation. So there's been a huge spotlight on this guy for many, many months over the money around NIL. And look, obviously he went after the bigger dollar figure. Obviously it didn't work out. So, but he's still a kid in the market, in a brand new market, trying to work things out. Tough break. I hate that didn't work out for him. But at the same time, I mean, I just looked at that number, and they compared it to, I believe, what Kenny Pickett signed for with Pittsburgh this year. First round NFL draft pick. That's insane. I absolutely do think we will come to a point in time. I think it's going to take quite a while, but I think there will be a point in time where these schools figure out this system and how to manage it, where I want to see guys who are coming back for their senior year, that junior who made the all SEC team, who maybe is like I'll give you an example right now up at Florida State, Jordan Travis coming back. Not that he was going to leave for the NFL draft anyway, but he's certainly incentivized to come back. Guy like that who can really help that team the next year. That's the type of guys you want to see get incentivized in this system. And the NFL took a long time to figure that out too. How many first number one picks or first round draft picks did we see that just ruined the franchise's finances for about 5 years before the NFL finally wised up and said, why are we paying all this money to rookies, guys who haven't played it down? They come in, they make more, all those statistics. Like this guy hasn't played down in the NFL. He made more money than Joe Montana his entire career. Like all those type of stories. That was idiotic. And I think they came to a point where they figured out a system with that. And I think there will be a system that's figured out over time. But right now, I'll tell you what the big issue with this system, if you're a player, you're extremely vulnerable, and you want to make sure that there needs to be some type of representation in for these players, which it sounds like there was an issue with the representation in this case, potentially, because like you said, maybe inexperience allows a clause like that to be included in a contract of that ilk. But over time, I do think this thing will get hammered down to look a lot different than it is about 5 to 10 years from now.
Oh, Nick, you're so naive. Like the NCAA is going to fight tooth and nail to delay because the TV money is
I
eventually.
don't know how much choice they're going to have, Will.
Well,
I'm not saying that's not their incentive that they're going to do it, but I'm saying there's stories like this do not look good. The schools aren't going to have it. The collectives aren't going to have it. The boosters aren't going to have it. This is not going to be tolerated to a huge degree.
so it's going to
stories like this come out.
That's where I disagree with you. I think it's going to be completely tolerated. I think the issue is going to be, when does someone sue? And so
that's going to happen if this keeps happening, Will.
But see, here's the thing: is you're talking about like the NFL system and how they finally got it right. Well, the NFL put a salary cap on rookie salaries, right? They basically said, and the incentive structure in the NFL was to pay giant amounts of money for hope. Right, that the first round draft pick that you brought in meant hope, which means you paid him a ton of money because you had to get him into camp, because otherwise your team wasn't going to be able to win. And recruiting is set up the same way. The problem is that if you set a rookie salary cap, or you set a recruiting salary cap, boy, now you're talking about National Labor Relations Board. Now you're talking about collective bargaining.
It doesn't even have to be official. It doesn't have to be official. But what I'm saying is, don't think these coaches aren't talking to each other.
Dude, that's even worse.
What they're paying.
That's even worse.
I'm telling you,
if they start colluding, the amount of money.
You don't think that's happening already?
I think that they are being very careful.
Come on, who's the naive one now? Who's the naive one now? You don't think that's happening already? Come on.
Well, I don't know.
You don't think Billy's talking to Nick Saban? No, Nick Saban's telling kids to take a hike for a certain amount of money.
Well, Saban's kicking his ass, so I don't know that it's exactly even.
Saban's telling. There's a whole story. Someone came in asking Saban for a certain amount. He told him, "Get out of here."
Well, so that actually is a really interesting thing, because I think, like at the quarterback position, the 64th ranked player in the country is the only guy that I have worth more than $1 million over 64th and above if you're nationally ranked for quarterback. But where I have it for running back or for edge is the 47th best player. And where I have it for, say, an offensive guard,
this is all
like
$1 million
the 24th
above?
ranked player, $1 million and above, right? So basically, somebody comes in and says, "I want $1 million," and they're like the 120th ranked guy. You should tell them to take a hike. That's completely out of line. Like, it sort of gets to a point where once you get out of maybe the top 150, these guys really are kind of worth a scholarship. It's the elite guys up at the top who are worth more than a scholarship, and NIL is really kind of, the market is working the way it's supposed to work. The guys up at the top are getting rewarded. It's not Rashada's fault that he walked into a situation where Miami and Florida both wanted to flex for a player who wasn't worth that much. It's just unfortunate that whatever happened with the contract, the snags wound up costing him that gold mine that he was going to get, because the market for Rashada was way hotter than it should have been. Good for him. You maximize your earnings if you have the opportunity to do so.
Right.
But shame on the folks who were actually doing the valuation, because $13.8 million should have set off bells, whistles, alarms, fires. Like they're like, the first thing
number was garbage when I heard that the first time. I was like, there's no way that to see that actually be confirmed. That's a staggering overpayment right there.
It's a dereliction of duty when it comes to assessing how are we going to value players in an era where you got to think about that. And where that dereliction stands is, I think, in the eye of the beholder. I know where I think it stands, but the reality is you can't be giving out $14 million deals to guys worth $4. And so in some ways, Florida comes out of this fortunate from the standpoint of not having those funds tied up with a player who, by all accounts, and I think by our evaluations too, is not a sure thing. If you told me $14 million for Lagway, I'd say you overpaid, but I understand. for Rashada, I go, that's tough.
That's actually a good point. I think if you look at a guy like Lagway, you look at his tape, you go, oh boy, that's a guy you might take a little extra steps for on that. But yeah, even that value is still crazy high. You're talking about NFL first round draft pick type of money for a guy that never played high school or never played college ball. It's absurd.
All right, can we stop talking about this now?
Yes, I was about to say that, and I was about to say, Will and I, we handpick these topics every single week, and we both are absolutely sick of talking about the Rashada situation. So I
So
think
feel free to submit what you want us to talk about, and
I
we'll do it.
think I think I can almost guarantee that this will be the last time we have to talk about Rashada on this show, and I'm very happy about it. Let's move on to a dollar. 9 Gators invited to the NFL Combine this year. 9 out of the 319 prospects invited. You know, when you look at what's been going on, I said to Will before the show, I know all the names. None of the names shock me that they're going to the NFL Combine. But when you think about how mediocre the football has been in the last couple of years, to see this many names, it's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive here. You got Richardson, of course, Osiris Torrance, Justin Shorter, Richard Garage, Jervon Dexter, Brenton Cox, Ventrell Miller, Trey Dean, and Rashad Torrance, all receiving the invites. Trey Dean, MVP of the Shrine Bowl. Trey Dean, you talking about there? MVP of the Shrine Bowl, had an interception in that game. Noticed someone running up behind him to go for the strip. He got down. He protected that football. He's been there before. Saw a lot of good gifs and memes off of that play there. But good for Trey Dean for getting that done.
So it's actually 10 guys who were invited to the combine, because Ricky Pearsall was invited too, but he decided to stay in school. So the interesting thing is, you know, the guys on offense, Anthony Richardson, okay, he's gonna be a first round pick. Osiris Torrance, he's gonna be a first round pick. Justin Shorter, it was time to go. He was a solid and actually explosive offensive player this past year. Richard Garage started almost 30 games, I think, at left tackle. And then so those are your 4 offensive guys. And even Ricky Pearsall, you would have said, hey, he performed at Arizona State, came to Florida, was able to perform pretty well in the SEC. I understand why he's there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how there's 5 guys from a defense that was that bad that, that are going to the combine. I mean, really, you think about it, Florida secondary was awful, and Torrance was a big part of that. Dean was a big part of that. Miller struggled at the linebacker position. Cox got kicked off the team. Dexter is the guy you look at and say he was a 5-star candidate. We all had really high hopes for him. Didn't necessarily pan out, but him specifically, I don't look at him and say he played poorly. In fact, Bud Davis did an analysis about halfway through the year where he looked at Dexter in the first half, and he's playing at an all SEC level, but he was also playing twice the number of snaps of a normal defensive tackle in the SEC. And then lo and behold, the second half, Jervon Dexter started playing worse there in the second half when he was completely gassed. So Dexter specifically, I think, is a guy you look at and say, I don't blame him in many cases for a lot of the defensive problems. But, you know, look, I mean, Cox, Dean, and Torrance were guys who I think Florida fans are happy to see move on. And so in some cases that may be right, in some cases it may be wrong, but, you know, to see that, and look, they're going to get an opportunity. Not everybody who goes to the combine gets drafted, but if Florida has 5 guys off that defense drafted, what does that say about the staff and their inability to get really the true talent level out of the players who are there? Again, I know that they don't fit, or they didn't fit Napier's staff and Tony's scheme and those sorts of things. But, you know, if you got 5 guys who end up getting drafted in the NFL, you should be better than 100th in total defense in the SEC. And that's a little bit concerning to me.
Yeah, Miller, I believe he invited to the Senior Bowl, Ventrell Miller, and he had to miss. So. He had to miss because he ended up getting surgery, so he wasn't available to play. And that Cox is the one I'm very interested in seeing. I'll be following him closely in his career because I'm very interested. Just so much talent. If he could get in the right system with the right coach, I think he could be a steal at the back end of the draft. I mean, I think he's got the talent, the type of talent, the way he explodes off the edge. If he gets a little more discipline into his game and he gets the right situation, he could be a great player for a long time in the league. And I think you look at that just seems like it's got Bill Belichick written all over it with Cox.
We've been saying that for him for 3 years, though, right? Yeah. It's like, we just need this to improve. We just need this to improve. And then Texas A&M is running around the corner for a touchdown like 3 times in the same game because the edge isn't set. And look, I think
he won't stay on the field, though. He won't stay on the field. He kept staying on the field here. He won't stay on the field in the league if he does that stuff.
Well, that's true, right? The accountability does make a difference. But again, when I talk about being concerned about about the staff and those sorts of things, that accountability is one of the things that I'm talking about, right? That you know, there were times last year where there were clear screw ups on the defensive side of the ball, and we didn't see changes immediately. Now, look, I know the young guys were going to struggle, and I know the young guys were going to make mistakes, but if you're 100th in defense, well, what are we really what are we holding on to, right? And so,
Mhm.
look, I mean, good for these guys. I hope they all get drafted. I hope that they all do well in the league. I hope that they valued their time at Florida and that Florida fans will support them, because even if you end up being a player who doesn't pan out based on your recruiting ranking, or even if you're a player who just was somebody who was sort of a whipping boy for especially the fan base, I still want him to do well. I want Trey Dean to do well in the league. I think it's good for Florida. I think it's good for Dean. I think it's probably cathartic for the fans in some capacity to see him do well. But I was surprised. I mean, I am surprised at the and again, like you mentioned, Dean winning the MVP of the postseason game says something, right? That he's a talented guy, and in those games, things get simplified, right? The schemes are simplified, and all those sorts of things. And so when you simplify it, and his athletic ability is able to take over, he becomes a very, very dangerous weapon. Makes me wonder about sort of the complexity of both the Todd Grantham defense, but also the Patrick Toney defense last year as well.
Yeah. Hey, look, when you go to the NFL draft, once your career's over at Florida, your Saturday sins are forgiven, and you move on to Sundays to play in the league. We'll be rooting for you either way. So looking forward to seeing how that turns out. A lot of good. The QB school, JT O'Sullivan, great breakdown on Anthony Richardson. If y'all haven't watched that, by the way, check that out. That was very good. I watched that. Watched that today. It was really interesting. All right, Will, that's it for this week. We'll see y'all next week. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the Super Bowl. In the meantime, last football game, last meaningful football game of the year here, Will. So enjoy the last of football season. In the meantime, have a great weekend and go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.